Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Aparna from IIT Bombay, and we are going to talk on the module Theorizing Informality from paper Sociology of Urban Transformation. After completing this module, we should be able to understand different ways to theorize informality, bypass and occupancy urbanism, informality as an idiom of planning, splintering urbanism, plan illegalities, and paradox of planning in India. We have discussed in other modules how the idea of the informal sector came to the attention of urban scholars and how informality manifests itself in domain of housing and settlements. And in this module, we ask the question, what is the relationship between formal and the informal in Indian cities? What does planning have to do with the emergence of informality? Is it correct to say that informality emerges only in response to a lack of adequate spatial and socio-economic planning? While the previous modules explained the rise of the informal sector and informal settlements with reference to inadequate livelihood and housing provision, this module tends to theorize informality in relation to the political economy of economic development. So far, our approach was to focus on the empirical manifestations and policy implications of the formal or informal divide in Indian cities. In this module, we attempt instead to theorize informality, that is, understand its nature based on evidence from India and elsewhere in the world. In other words, we dig deeper to understand the political and structural antecedents of informality in the Indian city. To frame our questions in a different way, why does the state fail to provide good quality jobs and accommodation to its citizens despite the political demands created by democracy? How is informality in livelihoods related, if at all, to informality in shelter? Are formal and informal really binary categories? And how, if at all, informality and formality are related? This module also introduces a number of key scholars and perspectives that have engaged directly or indirectly with these questions, from Sanyal to Bhattacharya to Kudwa, Benjamin, Serra, and Roy. The module is divided into three sections. Section 2 debates in various ways in which informality has been understood by urban researchers and goes on to discuss a number of alternative paradigms. It introduces the idea of bypass as it applies to urbanization, brings in the framework of splintering urbanism, originally conceptualized and applied in context of high technology fiber optic infrastructures in Europe, to understand patterns of fragmentation and polarization in public services provision in Indian cities. Section 3 provides an overview of a paradigm-shifting approach to informality that views it not as a failure but an outcome of planning in Indian cities. The section on brief summarizes and concludes. Understanding informality. In previous modules, we have considered the informal versus formal divide as it is manifested both in the spheres of labor and livelihoods, and that of shelter and settlements. Although studies of emblematic and lesser-known bastis such as Dharavi and others show the importance of mixed land use encompassing informality both in housing and the economy, we have not so far considered the why and how of the linkage between these two spheres. In this module, we not only consider the connection between informal settlements and economies in greater detail, but we also enumerate a variety of other settings or frames within which the spectrum of formal versus informal becomes visible. For instance, paradigms such as splintering urbanisms focus on dualism in infrastructure and services provisions, while those such as occupancy urbanism also spotlight the political dimensions of the divide. Scholars of urban informality propose a variety of frames for viewing the formal or informal, including as territorial formations or spatial categorizations like slum and the city, groups, informal labor, forms of organizations such as rule-based or relation-based, and knowledges and practices, among others. To understand informality in the frame of organizational form, to take one example, scholars have explored the emergence of youth-led autonomous social groups in Brazilian favelas or shanty towns. McFarlane's and Weibel articulate a second theme common to the theorizations of informality, which is presented further. The critical interrogation of the formal versus informal divide itself. Scholars, including the ones discussed further, have sought to move beyond this dichotomy to a continuum of informality or interconnectedness and hybridity. Some of these authors, such as Roy, invert traditional understandings altogether to posit informality as a mode by which the state exercises its powers. Thus, more than the formal or informal gap, the paradigms discussed further analyze urban informality as a correlate or as a manifestation of broader processes of socio-spatial fragmentation in the course of socio-economic development. Let's discuss informality as a space, segregation, and disempowerment. Kudwa's analysis of the spatial and political impacts of urban informality falls outside the rubrics explored here, but it is notable for seeking to connect the twin lenses of shelter and work through which informality is separately viewed. Pulling together evidence from Delhi and Ahmedabad, he argues that informal space, in the sense of Lefebvre, whom we have discussed in great detail in Module 1.3 titled Right to the City. So Lefebvre, which brings together informal as a site both of the livelihood and settlements, produces patterns of deep segregation in the city along caste, communal, and class lines. Thus, while on the one hand the informal is the site of mixed use, as described in Module 4.2, it is characterized by high degrees of socio-spatial polarization. The spatial politics of informality, thus conceived, is marked by violence and failure of impediments to collective action by workers. Ahmedabad has seen increasing communal separation and bouts of violence. In Delhi, the removal of industrial units from mixed-use areas in the early 2000s was met with limited but violent labor mobilization. Thus, in Kudwa's view, informality in Delhi and Ahmedabad has produced patchworks of segmented localities in which spaces of work and living overlap to various degrees. This has rendered these spaces poorly prepared for collective action and vulnerable to being pushed to the periphery by neoliberalizing state and planning mechanisms. In contrast to Kudwa's pessimistic prognosis on informality, we now turn to a different set of paradigms that view it in more dynamic terms. The other concept is of bypass urbanism. It is one of the powerful perspectives that connects the development of master planned new towns as a representative of a capitalist accumulation economy to the growth of an informal need economy characterized by self-employment, and was provided by the economist Kalyan Sanyal and Rajesh Bhattacharya in a 2011 article. Employing a Marxian framework, these authors critically examine the new townships that seek to create new spaces for new forms of services, sector-led economic activities such as information technology, business process outsourcing, the BPO, that are closely integrated with the global economy. Such spaces of bypass may include exclusive corridors of transport, enclaves of business, and gated communities. Sanyal and Bhattacharya argument is that the accumulation economy seeks to build new townships and urban centers in order to bypass the squalor that characterizes older city areas where the need economy, based primarily on self-employment and subsistence-oriented labor, has encroached and established itself. Nonetheless, this bypass proves to be a temporary solution because over time the need economy comes to encroach on these new spaces. What form does this encroachment take? Here, Sanyal and Bhattacharya point to the case of Navi Mumbai, which is the largest planned new town in India. Even here, unauthorized settlements evidently comprised a large 39% of the population in 2000.
This local economy included three major population segments. According to Shaw, quoted by Sanyal and Bhattacharya, a floating migrant labor force in the construction industry who erect temporary shelters during their stay. A permanent workforce engaged in low-paid jobs in industry and service establishment, in domestic work in middle and upper middle class homes, and a self-employed who live in shanties and slums, and villagers who lost their agricultural land for the development of Navi Mumbai and who now serve as the core of a non-agricultural local economy. So in the Indian context, the need economy gains a foothold because the accumulation economy also generates a survival circuit of low-paid service jobs such as nannies, housemaids, cooks, drivers, security guards, handyman. In India, it is the informal need economy that services the workers in its survival circuit. Furthermore, in an interesting twist that parallels Shaw's description of the local economy of Navi Mumbai, Sanyal and Bhattacharya contend that it is those displaced by the new towns who return as producers and providers of subsistence to the laborers in this survival circuit. Indeed, pulling together other examples such as Rajarhat New Town near Kolkata, Sanyal and Bhattacharya suggest that these loops of eviction, bypass and encroachment are central to the persistence of informality in Indian cities, even as the development of new townships to bypass the need economy requires the displacement and eviction of existing populations. The accumulation economy itself facilitates the growth of the need economy in its surrounds. However, there is also a political dimension to this bypass and encroachment loop that is key to their argument.
Let's talk about splintering urbanism. The concept of splintering urbanism emerged from Graham and Marvin's attempt to characterize the telecommunications infrastructure that were being built in the West in the 1990s. In key aspects, the wiring of cities with fiber optic networks resonated with patterns of public services provisions that had long typified cities in the developing world. Notable particularly were dynamics of dualization, such that some premium network spaces were equipped with the dense global local network infrastructures, while other locations, even those that were geographically close to such spaces, languished as network ghettos. Central of these processes of dualization were bypass strategies, that is, strategies that seek the connection of valued or powerful users and places, while at the same time bypassing non-valued or less powerful users and places. Indeed, premium network spaces allow elite group access to high-quality, globally connected telecommunications networks, even as they are increasingly withdrawn from the local urban fabric. Graham and Marvin, quoted in Kotia 2008. In other words, though conceptualized and applied originally in a very different context, Graham and Marvin's in 1998-9 account of splintering urbanism and also appeared to echo the existence of well-provisioned enclaves such as cantonments or new townships alongside areas of poor infrastructure provision. It is not surprising then that their ideas have been adapted to the Indian context by a number of scholars working across different settings. Although splintering urbanism framework does not directly employ or engage informality as a concept, it predicts the rise of urban dualism or fragmentation in the sense of poorly provisioned spaces existing alongside well-endowed enclaves. We have already seen how Sanyal and Bhattacharya also use the term bypass to describe similar processes, although their theorization is very different. Splintering urbanism has emerged as a particularly valuable conceptual framework for scholars who examine the development of informal technology hubs in cities such as Hyderabad and Bangalore. In these settings, it has been applied to explain patterns of service differentiations with respect to a variety of public service infrastructures such as road, expressways, where connectivity privileges premium network spaces like the Electronic City Industrial Township. Some scholars have also invoked into the theory the more general spatial repercussions of newly developed premium network spaces in Hyderabad's high-tech city and financial district.
Occupancy urbanism. One author who has grappled extensively with the issues of politics of informality that are traced out in Sanyal and Bhattacharya's analysis of bypass and encroachment is Benjamin. Based on fieldwork in cities such as Bangalore, Delhi, and Chennai, Benjamin has brought to the fore the significance of tenure arrangements to the ability of poor groups to make claims in the city. These insights are crystallized in the idea of occupancy urbanism, which in a 2008 article Benjamin linked to the new political platforms forged by poor groups in both claiming public services and safeguarding territorial claims. Such occupancy is embedded in multiple de facto through not always de jure tenures that are recognized and embedded in the knowledge bases of the lower bureaucracy. In previous research with Raman on Bangalore's local economies, these authors highlighted not only the highly specific economies and lineages, including histories of rural-urban links, migration and financing circuits in a range of localities around the city, but also the land tenure arrangements and that predominate. A chief feature of the occupancy urbanism paradigm is thus the importance it assigns to tenure arrangements both in reinforcing the poor's claim to urban land and their productive potential. In its focus on tenure, the paradigm recalls De Soto's insistence on the tenure as a pathway out of poverty in Latin America, makes a radical departure from the latter's perspective by emphasizing the multiplicity and fluidity of tenure arrangements in Indian cities. Benjamin and Raman do not only count ownership but also occupier, lease and rental rights. They also include tenure arrangements associated with revenue plots, gram thana or layouts on village land and squatter settlements, among many others. Equally important, they highlight the local economy linkages of these tenure arrangements. For example, consider the dizzying range of tenures and associated economic activities in Bangalore's Valmiki Nagar area. These authors argue that tenure diversity is critical for surplus generation, that is, the productivity of these local economies, and for moving new groups and migrants through the renting, lease, occupier, owner cycle. Yet, beyond its richly textured analysis of tenure and its linkages with local economies, the occupancy urbanism framework also underlines the political contestations which are often dismissed at vote-buying politics that allows such groups to make claims in the city. In Benjamin's view, such subversive politics often stands in opposition to citywide master plans as well as large-scale policy-promoted mega projects. At the same time, it is both flexible and successful in negotiating for territorial and public service claims with municipal bureaucrats and local politicians as well as smaller developers. This allows for the local economy to capture the real estate surpluses resulting from reconstituted land tenure. Informality as a mode of planning. An incisive conceptualization of informality comes from the work of Ananya Roy in settings such as Calcutta. Roy contended that informality does not result from lack of planning. It is instead a direct outcome and indeed mode of planning itself. Drawing on two disparate scenes of Indian urbanization, first, the planning and development of Bangalore's new airport in 2008, and second, in the contestation around acquisition of land near Nandigram. She defines informality as a state of deregulation, one where the ownership, use and purpose of land cannot be fixed and mapped according to any prescribed set of regulations or the law. To illustrate the thesis that informality is a mode of deregulation, Roy asks, how can I find the appropriate map? Who owns this piece of land? What uses are planned for it? She says finding answer to these questions are nearly impossible in definitive ways. Instead, The responses to these questions remain fluid and contested because multiple claims are made by different groups and individuals on the same piece of land and sometimes involve a multitude of government agencies as well. Against this backdrop, deregulation of or informality is what allows the state to alter land use, deploy eminent domain, and to acquire land for urban and industrial development. In previous discussion, we have viewed informality as a tactic of poor and marginalized groups skirting the edges of legality in livelihoods or housing. Roy's contribution is very significant because it reverses this lens to understand informality as a mode for the exercise of state power. The idea of informality from above highlights the fact that the state itself is an informalized entity. Such informality from above offers two major implications for our understanding of how informality shapes Indian cities. First, whether in livelihoods or settlements, informal or formal can go longer be seen as dichotomous categories, but deeply connected to each other at their very genesis. Second, Roy suggests that informality is less a grassroots phenomenon, but rather a feature of structures of power. Informality is not to be equated with poverty or marginalization, but it is a practice adopted by privileged and state actors. Yet in later work, Roy has also returned to the idea of subaltern urbanism, which provides accounts of the slum as a terrain of habitation, livelihood, self-organization, and politics. This suggests a notion of subaltern informalities, which bears closer resemblance to the motifs occupancy urbanism and encompasses and conjoins the many domains of informality. It also stands in opposition to elite informalities. As is evident, Roy's theorization of informality as an idiom of urbanization has revolutionized scholarly thinking on the urban in India. It has inspired a wide range of studies both in India and elsewhere. Two lines of investigation closely related to Roy's ideas are worth mentioning. The first, which examines how subaltern informality relates to the master plan and the ways in which it deploys informality from above. And the second is a literature that pays attention to how informality from above is made possible at all. Based on our discussion so far, what can we say about how planning relates to the rise of unplanned settlements? Model 4.2 has already discussed the variety of informal settlements delineated by Bhan. However, there was a second component to this analysis. Bhan analyzed the history of informal settlement growth around subsequent master plans in Delhi in order to examine what, if any, relation the growth of the unplanned city bore to the master plan. A careful mapping using lists of unauthorized colonies that had applied for regularization in three waves between 1962 to 2009 revealed an intriguing pattern. Even in 1993, the 1962 Delhi Master Plan showed a clear relationship of the location of unauthorized colonies. An analysis of Jhopri clusters using 2010 data from the national capital's boundaries showed a similarly striking pattern. Even in 2010, existing and evicted bastis largely lay within the boundaries of Delhi Master Plan 1962. Bhan concludes that the master plan thus serves as a bounding condition for unplanned settlements. Keeping Jhuggi-Jhopri clusters close to the public lands acquired in central Delhi in the 1950s, his account highlights the limits of informality as a mode of planning in contestations with other state actors such as the courts, that view and enforce the plan as a legal document as much as state strategy. Thus, even as development authorities attempt to create arenas of deregulation, these may be subject to regulation by other state actors. Bhan's argument also has significant policy implications because it highlights the importance of planned boundaries even for shaping the location of unplanned settlements. Second, it underscores the potential role of public lands in helping high-income residents make claim to densely settled central urban areas with ample access to markets and employment.
So let's talk about exceptions and exemptions.
So far, the paradigms of informality we have discussed have been focused on what Roy calls subaltern informality and how it emerges in urbanizing India. Yet if informality is a mode by which state plans and governs Indian cities, in what ways is such informality from above realized? Here it is useful to consider another literature that examines the functioning of the state. Ivor Ong's paradigm of exceptions, that is, extraordinary departure in policy, as a mode of neoliberal governmentality, has emerged from settings such as the Chinese special economic zones. But it has been influential in characterizing processes of deregulation in India and elsewhere. In the Indian context, Guru Rani draws on Roy's notion of flexible planning, which, according to her work in Gurgaon, encompasses a range of political techniques through which exemptions are routinely made, plans redrawn, compromises made, and brute force is executed. Guru Rani's work highlights that legal framework developed over the 1970s that allowed Gurgaon to emerge such as zone of exemption, with private developers being given unprecedented leeway in shaping the city. Although Guru Rani does not invoke Roy's reframing of informality in this work, her work offers an interesting case study of informality from above.
So let's talk about what did we learn out of this module. As previous modules have shown, processes of informality, whether in the domains of livelihoods or habitat, they came to scholarly attention in the countries of the South on the trajectory of economic development. Nonetheless, Al-Sayed asks the question, is it the informal that is the newer phenomena? Or is it the formal which came to characterize processes of modernization in the 19th century? Historical perspectives such as Polanyi's would suggest that it's formal markets that came to be invented in the 19th century. Al-Sayed argues, however, that liberalization and globalization have over the last few decades transformed the nature of informality. Informalization has spread to larger sections of workforce beyond those hitherto regarded as marginalized or poor. It is not surprising then that the paradigms of informality presented in this module, it has tended to push beyond the binary of formal informal to encompass the broader array of domains, whether in Kudwa's conceptualization of informality as space to Benjamin's view of occupancy as a mode of politics. Equally, they have appended traditional views of informality as a space of marginality or passivity to highlight its dynamism. Indeed, in Roy's framework of informality as mode of state functioning, we see informality as far from marginal, but in fact central and powerful. If informality is indeed an idiom of urbanization, as these modules have shown in different ways, it is critical to understanding the evolution of Indian cities. Thank you.